Hi folks, welcome to part 2. Why don't we jump right in? I think this video will take around 7 minutes, maybe 6. Okay, we will start with registration. So assuming that I fill this out properly and I click on the register button, what should happen? Well, let's switch to my editor. I will visit my routes file. And yeah, of course, we already have an endpoint set up in the previous episode. That will hit a store action on the registered user controller. All right, let's write it out. What needs to happen in order to register a user? Well, we have to validate the form. Always got to validate. Next, we should create the user in the database. Next, of course, we should sign them in. So log in, and then finally redirect them where we want them to go. Should it be their dashboard? Should it be back to the home page? Whatever would make sense. Redirect somewhere. All right, let's get to work. So we already know how to validate. I can say request validate. Now, if I switch back, we need to validate the first name, last name, email address, and password. Okay, so I'll show you a little trick. If you happen to be using PHP Storm and the Laravel IDEA plugin, I can actually hit Command N within this array and choose Add Eloquent Model Fields. I reference the name of the model, and it will do its best to automatically generate the validation fields, which I think is pretty cool. Now, in this case, though, it's doing a little too much. I don't need a remember token. I don't need email verified at. All right, let's reformat. And the only other thing I might want to change here is, do you require a minimum number of characters for the first name or last name? Is a last name or first name required? Maybe it's optional for your system. In our case, we will say it's required. All right, so for email, it should be required. It should be an email, and they have set a maximum number of characters. That's often a good practice to get into, but we're going to leave them off for now. Okay, finally, for the password, is there a specific shape that we want the password to take? We've all signed up for applications where it's got to be, at least 2 numbers, at least 1 uppercase character, a certain length. Generally, I find those rules do more harm than good. But nonetheless, if that's what you want, you have the option. And because it's complex enough, Laravel has a password helper class. So notice it's illuminate, validation, rules, password. And you can almost think of this sort of like a Fluent API for setting your rules. So for example, if I want to set a minimum number of characters, I could do so like this. And notice I can continue chaining. So if I want to set a maximum number of characters, if I want to, and by the way, I can command click to read the documentation here. If I want to confirm or require that at least 1 letter is used, then I can call the letters method. If I want to do the same but for numbers, then I can call the numbers method. And again, notice how these methods return the instance so that you can chain as much as you need to. So I could say, you got to give me letters, you got to give me numbers, the maximum number of characters, again, whatever you want. Now, one thing to keep in mind is if you would be referencing these rules all over the place in your application, you can instead put it in your service provider, and then that would allow you to simply reference your application's defaults. Now, in this case, I want to stay on task, so we're not going to review that. But yeah, if you're interested, have a look at laravel.com/docs/validation. In our case, we'll keep it very simple. I will say it needs to be at least 6 characters. And then I will add one more called confirmed. I like this one. Okay, so here's how it works. When you apply it to a request field, Laravel is going to look for another attribute that has this name, password, underscore, confirmation. And it's going to make sure that this attribute and the password confirmation attribute match or are the same. Now, generally, it's going to be applied to the password attribute, but you could do it to email if that would make sense. So if I did this, then Laravel is going to look for an attribute or an input with the name of email confirmation. That's the way that works. So you'll remember, if I go back to my register view, we have a confirm password field, and notice what the name is, password confirmation. So notice I didn't say confirm password because that's not going to work. In order for that validation rule to work, it needs to be the related attribute underscore confirmation. And actually, while we're here, I noticed a little mistake from the last episode. The type here should be set to password. Okay, multiple cursors. You know how they are. Okay, so I'll switch back, undo this, and we are ready to continue on. Great job. So we've validated the request. The next step is to create the user. User creates, and I'll show you a little tip. Yes, I could repeat those attributes. So I could say first name is, well, get the first name from the request. Then do the same for last name. Then do it for email. But if you want, assuming that this validate method succeeds, it's going to return the validated attributes. So I'll show you this. Let's comment this out, and then I will die and dump the validated attributes. Let's have a look in the browser. So I will do John, Jacob, blah, 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 password. We submit it, and yeah, the validation succeeded, and now it returned the validated attributes. So notice, this is effectively what we want to pass to the user create method. Okay, so with that in mind, I could do something like this. Validated attributes. Okay, so in the wild, validated attributes, that works, I guess. It's a little verbose. I have seen personally simply attributes. I've seen validated. That sometimes signals a Boolean, but I have seen that many times. If you want to do a shorthand, it doesn't matter. And you could even inline the validation entirely, and that would work as well. And sometimes that's kind of fun. But yeah, let's just stick with, how about, let's do attributes this time. Cool, right? All right, let's continue on. So at this point, they have submitted the form. They have passed validation. We have created a user in our database. Now we will log them in. Now, Laravel ships with an auth class. Notice illuminate, support, facades, auth. And there's a method called login. Now, as the first argument to this login method, I need to provide the user that I want to log in. Shocker. So after we create the user, that will return the new user, and I can pass that to auth login. Nice and simple. All right, final step. Where do we redirect? Well, maybe, I don't know, maybe the first thing you want to do is visit your dashboard or your settings page or the jobs page. Let's stick with that. Redirect to jobs. And that's it. That's your basic controller logic for registering a new user. Let's try it out in the browser. Let's fill out the fields. And submit. It fails. And yeah, once again, this is related to fillable fields for the model. So you'll remember we solved this problem for the job class, but not yet for user. So what I can see here is it's allowing the email address and the password, but not the first and last name. So if I open that user class, and again, that will be an app models user. Yeah, this is what Laravel includes by default. And notice there's no first name or last name. So if you want to fix this, either update these like so, or of course, like we learned, if you know what you're doing and you feel confident that you're not going to dump all request data into, for example, the create method, instead you could set protected, guarded to an empty array. You don't need to guard anything for me. I know how to use a sharp knife. I can take care of this. All right, so if I come back, I will simply hit refresh to try again. And there we go. So we don't have any feedback yet. It might be useful to have a flash message that we put into the session, but we can confirm it works. Let's visit our database. All right, let's open the users table. And sure enough, we have our John Jacobs account. It worked. Now, here's kind of a fun thing. Notice how I used a horrible password, but when it was saved to the database, it was actually a hashed version of it. Now, that's interesting because we didn't hash it ourselves in the controller, and yet still it worked. So what's going on here? How did that happen? Well, I'll show you. Let's open the user model. And again, this code was provided out of the box by the framework. We didn't write any of this. But sure enough, I see a method called casts. Get the attributes that should be cast. All right, so think of this as a way to manipulate a value when you fetch it or when you set it. And sure enough, I see one called password right here, hashed. Okay, so what this means is when we set a password on user, I want to automatically hash it. All right, so let's just try this out from the terminal. PHP, artisan, tinker. Let's create a new user, app models user. Let's set a password to password. And now notice if I grab that value, now that value is effectively piped through that cast. And of course, Laravel provides a bunch out of the box, and you can even create your own, which is really helpful. Okay, so that's kind of a quick primer. Maybe we'll touch on that more in the future. So we're in good shape, but notice right up here, I no longer see the login and register links. And that would make sense. We implemented that logic at the end of the last episode. Let's return to that. I will go to our layout. And yeah, right here, we said, well, if you're a guest, only on that condition should we display these links. Let's do another one. I will duplicate this, but this time we will say auth. So only on the condition that you are authenticated or signed in. And in this case, I want a log out link. Now, here's one thing to keep in mind. Beginners will often use a simple GET request for their logout link. And yeah, it is helpful because then you can set up an anchor tag to instantly log out the user. So if I come back and refresh, now we see it because we are authenticated. However, generally, this is frowned upon. Ideally, we should submit a post request to log out the current user. Otherwise, for example, even if you were on Facebook.com. If they wanted to be malicious, they could have a link that sends you to Laracast.com/logout. And they could call it something else like view popular posts. But then when you click on it, it's not showing you popular posts. It's actually logging you out of Laracasts, which they shouldn't be allowed to do. So that's why a GET request for logout is generally frowned upon. So with that in mind, let's instead use a form. We'll have a form button. We might have to tweak the styling here, but let's see if we can make it work. And we'll say log out. All right, let's switch back, give it a refresh. And yeah, the styling is different, but you know what? It's fine. I don't mind. All right, so where is this going to send us? Well, let's switch back to our routes file. And again, let's keep it really simple. If you make a post request to log out, that will hit the destroy action on the session controller. Okay, so we have our endpoint. Let's switch back. That will go to log out, and I'll do this at the front. The method will be post. All right, the only remaining step is to add our CSRF token, and I think we're all set. All right, so let's go into session controller. We're now going to destroy a session, and once again, sanity check. Log the user out. Are we properly hitting this action? Let's come back, refresh, press log out, and there we go. Okay, so yeah, why don't we just take care of this right now? Because after that, we can start working on the login functionality. So if we can log in a user by saying login user, then we can log out a user by saying log out. And in this case, I don't have to provide a user because it assumes the currently authenticated user. All right, so let's import that. And then finally, after we log out a user, let's redirect them to the home page. That sounds good to me. All right, so let's give it a shot. Come back, refresh. I'm on the jobs page. I click log out. I'm redirected to the home page. I'm no longer authenticated. So now I once again see the login and register links. Cool. So that brings us to the final step. I need to log in. Okay, we're going to use those credentials that we provided when we registered. So the email address is John Jacobs and my password is password. Log in. We hit that endpoint and we die and dump the values. All right, a little bit more work to do here. I'll show you. All right, so once again, let's get in the habit of writing out what needs to happen. First, we should validate the form. Next, I should attempt to log in the user. Remember, validation could pass, but then when we attempt to sign them in, if the password is wrong, that step is going to fail. All right, so try to log them in. If it succeeds, one little side effect we should do is regenerate the session token. This is a little lower level, but we'll talk about that when we get to it. And then finally, I think we're all set, so we can redirect. Okay, so let's begin. I'll do it a little faster this time. Request, validate. The email address is required, and it should be an actual email address. And then the password is required, and that's enough. Okay, so validation is complete. Let's save the validated attributes to a variable. Next, attempt to log in the user. So once again, we're going to reach for our handy dandy notebook auth class. And notice there's a method at the top called attempt. Let's see what the parameter list is. Include the credentials, and then if you want the application or the session to remember the user, you can set that to true. Okay, so the credentials will be, of course, the email address and the password, which we fetched here. Let's pass it in. Now, this attempt method will return a Boolean. Could it successfully log you in or not? Let's start with the happy path. Okay, next, regenerate the session token. Let's put a pin in that for one more minute. I want to stay on task. But yeah, I will write it out. Request session regenerates. But yeah, you can imagine it's a security thing that effectively recycles the session token. Okay, finally, redirect. Yeah, once again, if this is all about jobs, then I'm going to send you to the jobs page after you sign in. But yeah, maybe your dashboard, maybe a settings page, maybe the home page, whatever you want. Okay, so again, I said happy path. Why don't we have a look in the browser? So here's the login form. Let's sign in John Jacobs with that horrible password. And it worked. And I can tell that I'm signed in because I do see that log out button at the very top. Cool. But let's log out, go back to login. And this time I will choose John Jacobs, but I will provide a password that doesn't match. All right, let's see what happens in this case. Log in and, it redirected me, but I'm definitely not signed in. All right, so what's the deal? This is confusing. But actually, it makes perfect sense if you think about it. We performed form validation, and it passed. You did include an email and a password. Next, we attempted to sign you in, and it failed. So false was returned from the attempt method. But we didn't do anything with it, so we just continued on. Regenerate the token and redirect. And that's how we end up here, but not signed in. All right, so, and I promise I'm not going to be long here, but it sounds like we need to handle the very real and likely possibility that authentication is going to fail. So in that case, if you think about it, it's almost like a validation error, isn't it? Sorry, you didn't provide an email. Sorry, you didn't provide a password. Sorry, your credentials do not match. So let's see if we can treat it like a validation error. Now, back in my controller action, let's negate this. We'll say, well, if you could not log in the user, then I basically want to throw a validation exception that then gets converted into a validation error within the form. That way we provide feedback to the user. And luckily, outside of the request validate method, this is pretty easy. I can throw an exception. Now, Laravel includes a validation exception class. And be careful, there's a bunch here. The one you want is illuminate validation exception. Now, it has a method called with messages. This would be an array of messages to associate this error with. So I want to associate it with the email attribute or the email input in our form. Now, the value can be, sorry, those credentials do not match. And yeah, that should do it. So why don't we try this out in the browser? Back to the login page, I will sign in John Jacobs using an invalid password and sorry, those credentials do not match. Try again. But actually, while we're here, and by the way, that's kind of cool that we solved that problem. But while we are here, notice that it emptied out those input values. And that can sometimes be annoying. I now have to start all over just to fix what is possibly just a one character difference. So it sounds like I want to display the old values from before the form was submitted. That way I don't have to start all over. Okay, I'll show you how to do that super quickly. If I go into the login page, here's the email input. And yeah, I could set the value to anything I want. And of course, that works. You already know that. But yeah, if I want, Laravel includes an old helper function. I've referenced the attribute name, in this case, email. And yeah, it's going to give me that old value for the attribute from the session. All right, so now though, I want to show you why this doesn't work because it's often a point of confusion for newcomers. So I'm setting value to old email. And if I switch back to the browser, I see old email. And that would make sense, right? I'm referencing this as not a function call, but a string. So this is why we add that colon here. We are binding this value to an expression rather than a string. So when I have a colon, this is treated as an expression. When there's no colon, it's treated as a string. Okay? So let's bring it back, give it a refresh, and now it's blank because there is no old value from the session. Let's try again though. Submit, incorrect password, log in. Now, of course, the validation fails, but I do see the old input value, which is great. Okay, so very good. Now for password, it wouldn't make sense to display the old value, so we will typically omit that step. All right. So anyways, if I provide a real password, we are redirected and we are signed in to the application. Pretty cool stuff. All right. So let's wrap up. If we switch back to our session controller, I want to finish up with 2 notes here. Now, as you've learned, when we call request validate, if it fails, we don't have to manually redirect back to the login form. Laravel will do it automatically, and that's really helpful. So as it turns out, the exact same thing is true for validation exception. If I throw it, I don't have to catch it anywhere. It'll bubble up, and Laravel will catch it. It will then inspect the exception, and it'll see, all right, validation exception, we know these roads. We know what to do. So it then redirects back to the form and sends through the error messages. All right, number 2, session regenerate. Yeah, this does what you think it does. It is a security measure that protects against what's known as session hijacking. That is an attack where a hacker gains access to your session token. And a session token is sort of like a unique identifier that says you are authenticated for this application in that browser. So if a hacker could gain access to that token, they could then impersonate you, which is not good. So one way we can protect against that is by always regenerating the token whenever we sign you in. That way, even if somebody has an old token, it's not going to work because we recycled it. And that's how that works. All right, so this is the logic for logging in. Validate the request, attempt to sign you in, regenerate the token, and redirect you where you need to go. Congratulations, you did it. Part 2 is now in the books. Okay, so I would say you now have 85% of the necessary knowledge to begin building your own login and registration system. Okay, so on that note, the reason, by the way, that I'm not saying 100% is because, well, there's things we didn't cover, obviously. We only have so much time in these videos. So one thing I would recommend is reviewing rate limiting. Think about it. Right now, if I log in with incorrect credentials, I can just try again and again. And again, and again, and again. I could do it hundreds of times. I could automate that from the terminal, which clearly is a big security concern. And then second, we didn't yet cover resetting your password. There's actually a number of steps involved in that, and I was worried about it being maybe a bit overwhelming. And you know what? We haven't even talked about delivering email, which of course should come first. So yeah, let's put a pin in that just for now. Okay, so in the next episode, you're going to love this. We will move on to authorization, which, like everything, Laravel makes a cinch. I'll see you then.